What do we mean by sexual dimorphism? What does that term mean? All right, so sexual dimorphism. So we've already talked about the fact that we are organisms that reproduce sexually, and we are by no means the only organisms that reproduce sexually. Most animals do, and not just animals, but most plants do, fungi do. What does it mean to say that we reproduce sexually?
It needs two.
It needs two. Keep going.
Two, like, different people. Not people, but like things.
Yeah, sure. That's right. So it's reproduction where there is more than one contributor to the genes, right? And by the way, it's not always two organisms. There are plants that can impregnate themselves or fertilize themselves. There are animals that can fertilize themselves, impregnate themselves. Impregnate isn't the right term. That's a very mammalian term. We'll get to that. I'm going to push you off till we talk about reproductive systems in our animal systems unit. But yeah, the idea is that in sexual reproduction, all the cells involved are diploid, which means that we have two copies of each allele of each gene, two alleles. But in the process of procreating, we create these haploid cells. We create a cell that only has one copy of each gene, and two of those have to come together to make a new organism, right? So it's the coming together of two organisms. And in the case of most animals and most plants, we exhibit what's called sexual dimorphism. And the idea of that is that there are two distinct body types, or, well, actually, that's not true. We'll get to that in a moment. It means that there's two distinct sex cells. So one male and one female. And before there are two distinct body types, which is what we're going to say next, that comes down to the fact that there's two distinct sex cells. So in humans, for example, the female sex cell is called ova for plural, singular is ovum, very good. And the male sex cell is spermatozoa, yeah. In plants, what do we call the female sex cell of a typical plant? Don't call it the egg. Plants don't lay eggs. It's on the flower, if it has flowers often. Related to it, the seed, typically, right? We talk about seeds. Plants have seeds. And of course, they have to be fertilized. And this is where flowers come in. The male sex cell can vary by plant, but frequently is pollen, right, from the flowers. So that's the job of the flower. The flower provides pollen, which is the male sex cell, which is used to fertilize the female sex cell, which is the seed. Does that make sense? So in sexual dimorphism, you have two distinct sex cells. And we'll use as an example of that, since I went this order, spermatozoa and ova. But that's just one example. But in addition to that, in dimorphism, di means what? Two. And morphism means, well, morph means, what does morph refer to? We talked about morphology, the morphological concept of speciation, for example. Yeah, just shape and structure. So in sexually dimorphic species, we have two distinct types of sex cells, but we also have two distinct body plans. And this makes us different from, for example, trees. All trees are hermaphroditic, right? They contain both female sex organs and male sex organs, right? They produce seeds and flowers. But humans typically, though not always, and we'll talk about that, don't. Most humans, most animals, most mammals have two distinct body types. And for those that do, we refer to them as being sexually dimorphic. This means that they share most major features. All right, so people who are biologically male and people who are biologically female have 2 arms, 2 legs, 5 fingers on each hand, 5 toes on each foot, 2 eyes, a nose with 2 nostrils, 2 ears, a brain, all these same basic features. But what are the features that are different between males and females typically? Well, the most obvious one the one that most relates to the fact that why do we have two different body types? Because we have two different sex cells, right? And so in relation to that, the primary difference, what we call the primary sex characteristic, is the genitalia. It's the reproductive organs. So what we call the primary sex trait are related to sex cells. In other words, it is the reproductive organs. Right? And if we use that as an example, again, if we're sticking with this idea of how we have sperm and ova in males and females, and we have two distinct body types, male and female, so we could say here, for example, you have a penis and testicles in the male body plan, right? And you have a vagina and you have ovaries in the female body plan, right? These are the sex organs that are responsible for the production of, the maintenance of, and the managing of the sex cells, right? But of course, those aren't typically the only differences we see in sexually dimorphic species, right? Are there other, we tend to make pretty accurate assumptions about people's biological sex without inspecting the plumbing, which would be, considered poor manners as a rule. So what else do we notice? There's primary sex traits, and there are, what we call the secondary sex traits or secondary sex characteristics. These are not directly related to sex organs or to the production of sex cells, right? But these are just typical, though by no means always the case, differences in body shape and proportions. All right, and I mean, again, everything exists on a normal curve, right? So we'll talk about the fact that the male body plan typically has a stronger upper body, but there are absolutely plenty of women in the world who have a stronger upper body than I do, without a doubt, right? Everything exists on a normal curve, and those normal curves overlap one another, right? We talk about how men are typically taller, but of course there's many women who are taller than I am, and there's probably, if you're biologically female in this room, you've probably met many men who are shorter than you are. My mother is 5'7", my father is 5'3", right? So these things are true on average. It's very important to remember that we're talking about things being true on average, not at all being true definitively. Does that make sense? And that, by the way, is even true for the primary sex traits, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Even that is by no means this kind of automatically binary situation. So that's the basic idea of sexual dimorphism, which is that because the way we reproduce involves two distinct sex cells, what we have are two distinct body types that produce these sex cells, which means if you're born biologically male and you're fertile, you'll produce male sex cells, spermatozoa. And if you're born biologically female and fertile, you'll produce female sex cells, ova. By the way, a sizable and meaningful portion of the population, both male and female, are not fertile, and they don't produce either sex cells. But the question is, how? Magic. And sexual dimorphism, so sex determination, i.e., here's a new offspring, is it male or is it female? Happens in different ways for different species. But the thing you have to understand is that it's the same body plan. So the basic body plan for all animals and I shouldn't say all, so I'm just going to say animals because there's exceptions to everything. The basic body plan for animals is female. All of the both primary and secondary sex traits for male are just variations on female sex traits, all right? So during development, for example, the penis is just the enlarged clitoris that a man develops during production. The ovaries and the testes are the same structure, they just grow larger and end up externally. So they're just variations on each other. So the basic body plan for animals is female, male primary and secondary, and I hope that's okay, just for me to shorten that like that. Traits are modifications or variations to this plan. So at early stages in development, and if you ever get a chance in university or college to take a class on developmental biology, where you actually track organisms from conception, right? From just being a single zygote, a single cell into a full multicellular organism, adult, it's a fascinating thing. I only ever took one course in it. I'm by no means an expert, believe me, but I do have some knowledge. And the interesting thing is that in the early stages of development, there's no difference whatsoever between male and female. But fairly early on, changes begin to develop. What grows faster, what grows slower, what gets bigger, what gets smaller, right? And if you think about what is the difference between a male and a female, it sort of stereotypically, well, it's no difference than the difference between one female and another female or one male and another male, which is just that's all the same structures that are sort of stretched out differently. And I always think about, like, have you ever played a video game where, like, you get to design your character and those sliders for things, right? And you can make their head bigger and smaller and their shoulders bigger and smaller and things like that. That is literally what is happening at the genetic level. Just different genes are coding for differences here. But there's my question then. Where are those differences coded in? In other words, like, you got one copy of all your genes from your mom, one copy of all your genes from your dad, right? If you're biologically male in here, how much of your mom's DNA is useless to you because it codes for being a woman stuff? And if you're biologically male, if you're biologically female, how much of your biological father's DNA is wasted to you? Like, how does that happen? Does anyone know? I'll tell you what mediates it, which is that hormone levels during development determine biological sex. There are several involved, but what do we think of as characteristically the two major sex-determining hormones? Hormones. We'll get to that in a minute, but hormones. What hormones are involved? Yeah. Testosterone, good. If you look at the name, testosterone, testes, right? Like, this is literally the hormone that when present in high levels, women also produce testosterone, but when present in high levels during development, leads to the ovaries developing into testicles, right? Testosterone. That hormone continues to regulate male sexual function throughout the duration of their life. What do we think of as the hormone that drives production of ovaries and eggs? Yeah. Estrogen, good. And ester comes from a Germanic word that means egg, right? Literally the one that leads to the production of eggs. And again, by the way, men also produce estrogen, but they tend to produce it in lower levels. And again, these things all exist on a normal curve. So when estrogen levels are much higher than testosterone levels during development, you end up with somebody who's biologically female. When testosterone levels are much higher during development, you end up with a body that is biologically male in general. By the way, there are many, many, many cases where sex is indeterminate. Roughly about 5-ish% of all babies born have indeterminate gender. Up until about the 90s, you know what they used to do?
Cut one out.
Yeah, there's not always two sets of genitals, so sometimes there are, but often they would just say to mom, like, make a choice. You know, are we going with male or female? And that tends to not be what we do now. What we tend to do now is just let children grow older and kind of figure out for themselves where they feel like they fit in. But that's not some insubstantial thing. It's not some 1 in a million case. In a class like this, there's likely a person here who was like that. Could have been me. You don't know. Especially I wouldn't know, because again, when I was born, it would have just been a case of them saying, like, yeah, make a choice. Let's go for it. Yeah, I saw a hand though, sorry. Hand? Was there a hand? Yeah.
Oh yeah. When you're pregnant, if you want to decide the gender of your child, can you just inject hormones?
Yes. Now, they don't let you do that for obvious reasons. And we'll talk about how hormone regulation is not a simple thing. So this is not experimentation they do with humans, and you would not get ethical clearance to do it with humans. But in laboratory animals, you do this all the time. Absolutely. If you change the hormonal balance of an animal that on paper is genetically male, and you set its hormone balance so that it's going to express female sex characteristics, you get a female animal. Because genetics, all they are doing is controlling these hormone levels. So if you overpower that and change it, that's what happens. This is, by the way, transgendered people do all the time, right? When they want to have the secondary sex characteristics that match what their understanding of their gender is, they will take estrogen treatments or testosterone treatments, and they'll begin to develop secondary sex characteristics that match the gender, right? So example, estrogen and testosterone. Now, in humans, how is this controlled? In some animals, this is controlled by all kinds of different things. In crocodiliids, like alligators, crocodiles, and things like that, do you know what controls the gender? So egg gets fertilized, gets laid, it sits in a nest. They're not warm-blooded, they're not mammals, they don't nurse their young, they don't sit on the nest or anything like that. They just sit there, and the ones that are more to the inside and more insulated tend to be warmer, the ones on the outside tend to be colder, and temperature determines gender, or sex, not gender, it's a whole different thing. Is that how it works for us? If mom spends lots of time in the sauna, you get a female, and if she really likes cold showers, you get a male? Not typically. What's the regulatory mechanism in humans, which is not the regulatory mechanism in even the majority of animals? You mentioned it. What controls it? Yeah. So this can be regulated. Sorry? This can be regulated in many ways. And we're just going to put a couple here. Like we said, there are some species where the literally egg temperature during development controls that. But in humans, it's controlled genetically. And we talk about the X and Y, the X and Y chromosome. So, talk to me. What are the X and Y chromosome?
XX develops female, XY develops male.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah, you're right. What's that mean? Because we're not talking about a gene here. We're talking about a whole chromosome full of tons of genes, right? So here's the interesting thing. The X chromosome, let's actually make this a subheading. I call them the sex chromosomes. That's right. Believe it or not, guys, this is what this looks like rehearsed. Chromosomes. You can't even imagine if I was winging it. It would be horrific. Okay. The X chromosome is the 23rd human chromosome. It's short-ish compared to others, but has hundreds of genes. Actually, thousands of genes, pardon me. And most unrelated to sex. So the X chromosome is not at all like the chromosome that has all of the, bits to make a female on it. The X chromosome is just another chromosome. It's just kind of one of the other ones. But what's the Y chromosome? Is that the chromosome that has all the genes that say, like, hey, make a penis, make testicles, make I don't know, more facial hair? Make me pretend I know something about cars even when I don't, so that if somebody's car breaks down, I stand around it and offer advice even though I have no idea what I'm talking about. That's on the X, that's on the Y chromosome. Be honest, your dads do that too. Yeah?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? Yeah, somebody's like looking under the hood of a car and your dad who knows absolutely nothing about cars whatsoever sells them. I'm like, oh, yeah, what do you think's wrong with that? I do that. Anyway. Is that on the Y chromosome? What's on the Y chromosome? Do you know? It's interesting because we talk about this stuff a lot, right? Because there's so much talk and so much like politicization of sex and gender, and you get these people who, mostly old people like me who stand up and go, yeah, you're biologically male, you're biologically female, and that's the way it's made, and it's that simple. And of course it's not. The Y chromosome is a degraded copy of the X chromosome.
That's crazy.
And in fact, it's shrinking. And it's shrinking rapidly. In just the last few generations, the Y chromosome just keeps like falling apart and getting smaller and smaller. And this has happened to lots of other species. Lots of other species that used to have sex determination chromosomally like we do don't anymore. That's changed as a method. But it really only contains a handful of genes. So all of the genes to make a biological male are found elsewhere. None of them whatsoever are found on the Y chromosome. So all the genes to make testicles and a penis and all the other secondary sex characteristics and to produce sperm and, for your vas deferens and all these parts of the male reproductive system make them work, every single person in this room has all those genes, right? All of the genetic information required to make you biologically male is present in every single human. Likewise, every single gene required to make ovaries and to have enlarged breasts and working mammary glands and clitoris and just all these features are all present in every single person in this room. Every single human possesses both of them. The Y chromosome has nothing to do with that, and only a couple of the genes on the X chromosome have anything to do with that. They're scattered through all the other chromosomes, just like every other gene. So what is on the Y chromosome? Notably, a gene called SRY. And the SRY gene just activates testosterone release during development. And that means typically results in biological male sex characteristics. But it doesn't always. First of all, there's some alleles of SRY that don't work well. And so there's some people who are XY, but they're entirely biologically female. So if you were to look at their chromosomes, you'd say, well, this is genetically, this is somebody who's male, an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. But biologically, they would unambiguously be female. Some people will have secondary sex characteristics that fall right in the middle, and primary sex characteristics that fall right in the middle. Again, there is a substantial number of babies born every day on this planet where when they come out, the doctor doesn't know if they're male or female because those sex characteristics fall kind of in the range between them. And then there's a whole second set of people who develop both sets of primary and secondary sex characteristics, have two sets of genitalia. And again, these things are regulated. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Looking for a penis. Yeah, they're looking for a penis.
Yeah, but
Can I tell? No. Have you ever seen an ultrasound? It's just like a bunch of squiggly lines and wavy stuff. What happens every time is just to be fathers are like, it's a boy, and they're like, that's its leg. And you're like, oh, okay. And they're like, so you don't know? And they're like, no, you don't know. Yeah, I couldn't tell. But an ultrasonographer can tell. More often than not, they will send it off. Like if it's remotely ambiguous, they'll just say they can't see. So unless they can see really clear signs. But basically, like you're looking for the presence of a penis, that's sort of the most obvious thing that's there. And then the absence of it is sort of presumed to be female. And usually that's not clear in a first ultrasound. Sometimes it is. And you would expect it to be clear by like a late, like a third trimester ultrasound. So often people will go, the ultrasounds you get early on are to see if you're at the proper developmental stage. And it's uncommon for them to be able to do a sex determination then, but sometimes they can. Some babies are just exhibitionists, I guess. And then later on, usually they'll do a specific ultrasound for sex determination if a mother's interested in doing so. Did that answer your question at all?
I don't remember what my question was.
But yeah, that's what they're looking for. They're not looking at genes, obviously. An ultrasound is just a camera, but instead of using light rays to see something, it uses sound waves to see something. And because it's using sound waves, it's getting, a pretty blurry image, but you're literally just seeing like the physical shape. And then have you seen these like super creepy like 3D ultrasounds where it looks like you're seeing like a CG animation of your baby? I think it's creepy. We'll look it up later. But yeah, what they're looking for there is really that primary sex characteristic of what are the genitalia. And again, there's all kinds of reasons that they wouldn't be able to see that, ranging from just baby's position, right? If baby's legs are kind of together and they're folded in such a way you just don't see anything, or to, again, there are cases where it's just not clear, right? I think they've moved away from mistaken because the training has become more and more often just to say we don't know, as opposed to saying... Yeah, I mean, it happens, right? Like you can imagine that if in a late trimester, like a third trimester ultrasound, and they don't see the presence of penis, the assumption is we're talking about female, and then turns out it is. Because again, like you're using sound waves to visualize something that, is like inside a woman's body. Ultrasound's a pretty incredible thing. Has anyone ever had one? I had to have one taken of my liver once.
I have one taken of my knee.
And it's pretty weird because you're like, they're looking at my liver right now. Like my liver's inside my body, but there's a picture of it.
They were looking at my stomach.
Yeah.
So at first I'm like, what school did you go to?
Well, believe it or not, they're not as far apart as you think, and we'll talk about that next unit, right? But your heart sits here, and your stomach sits here kind of behind it, and, again, you're seeing inside someone's body, right? Like, it's not as easy as you think.
Let me see it, too.
That's really cool.
Yeah, I have a torn MCL, and they had to diagnose it.
And they used ultrasound.
They couldn't diagnose it from the ultrasound. I think an MRI. So.
Yeah. Anyone had an MRI? I had an MRI. That's freaky. Isn't that tube and all the sounds? Sorry? Really? They gave me earphones that were like all plastic and stuff, and then there was a music selection, and it was so horrible. I was like, oh, they have jazz and classical, and the jazz was all like elevator music jazz, and the classical, it was just very obnoxious choices. It ruined my day. Anyway, better choices. I would have watched High School Musical. The key thing to note is this, that this is, like, this word typically, and things like that, like, it's no joking matter. And I say that because, like, we're in a time right now where there's a lot of, like, politicization around gender and sex. And first of all, like, what do those two words mean? I'm going to take a 2-minute diversion from science to talk about social science. What's the difference between someone's sex and someone's gender? I wouldn't even say that. I think it's related to that, but I wouldn't even say that. I would say this. Okay, here we go. Let me ask you this. Think right now and give me your honest first answer. And if you're willing to say it out loud, great. And if you're not willing to say it out loud, that's true too. But what would you say it means to be like a man? What are some things that jump to mind?
Cars.
Cars, okay.
That's a joke.
Cars, okay. What else?
You have a penis.
Okay, you have penis, true. What else? Sorry? Facial hair? Now, the interesting thing is, I think if you ask this conversation when you're not in a biology class, you'll get answers like tough or aggressive or assertive or, things like that. And so this is the difference between sex and gender. Sex is when you're talking about plumbing, when you're talking about body parts, when you're talking about primary and secondary sex characteristics. You're talking about physiology, right? We're talking about bodies. And gender is an entirely different thing, right? Like, gender is where we talk about roles, right? Assumptions, stereotypes. In other words, like, when you ask people what it means to be a man, they say something like assertive or strong-willed or whatever. Well, that has nothing to do with this. It may relate to this, because one of the things that's true is, yeah, physically speaking, men tend to be bigger and stronger, right? But again, plenty of women who could, like, kick the living crap out of me or run 100 meters a lot faster than I can, right? So gender refers to, like, these boxes that society puts people in. So one of the things is, if you are biologically male, well, then people expect you to fit into the roles that we assign to people who are biologically male. You're supposed to be tough. I don't know what else you're supposed to be. You're supposed to, I don't know, be an awesome guitar player. Women can be awesome guitar players, but you see what I mean? And so when people talk about their gender, it really doesn't have anything to do with this. Now, having said that, some people who identify as a gender that doesn't match the sex they were assigned at birth, then choose to say, well, I would like to also modify this, right? Like that's what, even when we talk about transgenderism, it's kind of interesting because like really when somebody is dealing with changing their sex characteristics, it goes beyond gender. Now they're kind of modifying their sex to match their gender. But gender isn't anything to do with science. It's not anything to do with biology. They're two different terms. And it's important to understand they're two different terms, and people are entitled to their opinions or whatever about what those things mean, but they're talking about two different things. Gender doesn't have anything to do with biology, and sex doesn't have anything to do with roles, responsibilities, or what you're supposed to do, or what you're supposed to look like, or how you like to paint your nails or not paint your nails, or anything like that. Does that make sense? So like, what are we talking about in this class? We're talking about sex, which is, again, about body parts, not about gender, which is its own very interesting topic. Put that away. Yeah, put away. I like seeing phones in my class. So, this is the basic idea. So typically then, there's only two possible genotypes. And I got to put kind of in fact, I should say, a really chromosomal arrangements. Because it's not a genotype, because that's talking about a single gene. And in this case, what we're actually talking about are the chromosomes you have. You can have X with X, or you can have X with Y. Why can't you have Y with Y? What do we say up here? What is the Y chromosome?
Degraded.
Yeah, what does it have on it? Yeah, and the problem is, again, the X chromosome isn't about sex. It's got stuff like genes that make your eyes work, and genes that make your lungs work, and genes that make your liver work. And so if you don't have a copy of the X chromosome, you don't have eyes that can work, or a liver that can work, or lungs that can work, or a spinal cord that can develop. Well, we'll talk about that, because again, lots going on. But this would be non-viable. Does that make sense? Because X has all the genes. I mean, I guess except SRY, but it has essentially all the genes. So then typically, this lacks SRY, and so you'll typically get a female, right? Whereas here, SRY is present, and so that means during development, you're going to get heightened what levels again? Testosterone, which means typically that will result in somebody who's biologically male. Does that make sense? That's the basic rundown of it. Now, as Mary quite cleverly pointed out, the other reason that this isn't viable is because you get one copy of a chromosome from mom, one copy from dad, and of course, no matter what are you getting from mom?
X.
You're getting X, right? But even that's not quite that simple, so we'll talk about that. But yeah, so the result is a few things. So I'm going to ask you a question. No, you're good. You got this. And don't answer this out loud. Think it through, and maybe even want to draw a Punnett square. I don't know. The sex offspring? That doesn't even make sense. Or it certainly doesn't make sense in the way that I want it to. Which parent determines the sex of the offspring? So I want you to think about that for a minute. Talk to people next to you, but don't shout it out, and see if you can work it out. And not only which parent does, but how do they? If you're super pleased with your biological sex, which parent do you go home and say, thank you, parent, for having determined my biological sex? By the way, devoid of context, that would be a really weird thing to go home and say to your parent. Just so you know.
I'm gonna go say it to my mom.
Come off as a bit of a weirdo.
Wait, what did you say? What are we supposed to repeat to our parents?
I don't know what I said.
Come on, what did you say?
I said, thank you, parent, for determining my biological sex. I appreciate it.
I'll text my mom that way.
Well, should you be texting mom or should you be texting biological dad?
You do.
Yeah, is it bio mom or bio dad? Who makes that determination?
I'm figuring that out.
Yeah, figure it out. I don't know. Figure it out. Work it out. Draw Punnett square. Draw Punnett square. Draw mom, draw dad, draw Punnett square. Tell me what their offspring look like. You got this. Figure it out. You're smart.
Don't give it. Don't give it. Lisa, don't do it.
I drew you a Punnett square. I decided that you're half female and you're half male. I feel like that. Sometimes I have to man up. Listen, come here. So, men have all the same genes as females do.
Exactly.
So, why can they still not find a clit?
I just stop. You're done. There's the door. Get out.
What did I do?
What did you say?
My reaction.
All right, talk to me. Talk to me. What's my Punnett square look like? Yeah.
So you got four squares in the center, but there's an X, an X, an X, and a Y.
Hello? What is this? Can you just make a 4x4 grid? The 2x2 grid?
4x4 grid it is.
Two.
You said 4x4.
No, it's
Would you like?
2x2 grid.
Okay.
2x2 grid.
Okay. It is taking everything in my power not to get the ruler out here, but we'll go messy.
So
Okay.
on the top, you're gonna put X and X.
Oh, are we doing like the
Yeah, but you're gonna put one
I-
X on top
one
of
X
one
on one
columns,
side and one X
and you're going to
on
put. It's fine. It's fine. And put another one. Put the same thing on the other side. Now for the side, you're gonna put an X, and underneath you're gonna put a Y. And
This is going to be a mess.
that first
But I think I know what you meant, and I think I'm just being difficult. Yeah. Okay. Why is that? What is this? Why did that go there?
that's the female, and that's the male.
The female what?
Whatever the heck you call it.
I don't know what you call it. Don't try and trick me into doing your work for you. I know that trick.
Your chromosomal.
My chromosomes?
Yeah.
Can I tell you? I don't think that's true.
This is why he has
No, technically. since-
I accidentally called a man ma'am once at my restaurant. It was embarrassing. And he said, "What's your name?" I said, "Joe." And he said, "Joe, I may not be a very handsome man, but I would make one hell of an ugly lady." And I always think about that. Anyway, no, those actually aren't my chromosomes. Sorry? That's right, which you put here. Because this is actually the mother, right? And so what's the mother's genotype in this case, or chromotype more accurately? XX, right? And the father has what? XY. So what do these represent? What are these? Possible what?
possible gene.
Of what?
Possible gametes.
Which is what?
The individual sex cell.
That's right. So when mom makes a sex cell, no matter what, she's going to pass on an X chromosome, or she's going to pass on an X chromosome. They might be different. In fact, not might be, they will be different, right? They'll have different alleles on them, different copies, but no matter what, she's going to pass on an X chromosome. What about dad? These are his possible gametes. Though in his case, of course, we're talking about what? Yeah. Yeah. Now in this case, because he's XY, he may produce a sperm that is X, or he may produce a sperm that is Y. Now when they get crossed, what do we end up with here? Great, which is what? Female. Here? Yeah, which is female. Here? Which is biologically male. And here? Biologically male. Very good. So first of all, what are the odds of having males, the odds of having females? Well, 50% of the time, of the F1 generation, right, is male. And 50% of the F1 generation is female. This is true across the board. Outside of, there are situations where there are some reasons why one becomes more likely than the other physiologically, but generally speaking, there's a 50-50 chance, which is why worldwide, what is the rough breakdown of biological sex, male and female? Roughly 50-50. Obviously, social policies can come into effect, right? China famously, males incredibly outnumber females in my generation. Does anyone know why?
Because
The one-child policy. So what's that? So they're only allowed to have one child. Why would that change this? Why would there not still be a 50-50 chance?
Get rid of it.
Yeah, right? That's a dark side there. Like culturally, it was important to have male offspring, and so when they were only allowed to have one offspring, infanticide and abortion, even though it was illegal, of female offspring was rampant, was widespread. Right? So you ended up with a large population male. That's obviously not a biological reason for that, but a sociological one, right? Something to do with our society. Okay, who determined the gender of the offspring? Dad, right? Only dad can, because only dad has a Y chromosome that he can or cannot contribute. Does that make sense? So, the father's sperm determines the sex of the offspring. This is also interesting because it means if you're biologically male, where does your X chromosome come from? Mom. So interestingly, biological males are the only people who have a case where all of their genes on one chromosome come from one parent. Does that make sense? If you're biologically male, all of the genes on your X chromosome, which remember aren't mostly about sex, they're just stuff. They're just parts of, they're just traits, just like any other chromosome. If you're biologically male, all the traits that reside on the X chromosome come from mom. And the couple of genes that come from the Y chromosome, they all come from dad. Does that make sense? Whereas if you're female, all those traits that are on the X chromosome, you get from both parents, just like every other chromosome. Does that make sense? So if you're biologically female, your 23rd chromosome isn't any different than your 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, so on and so forth. Does that make sense? If you're biologically female, you have 2 copies of every single gene in your genome. But if you're biologically male, that's not true. You have a bunch of genes that, for you only have 1 copy of. Does that make sense? Because again, what is the Y chromosome? It's just this kind of little degraded mess that used to be an X chromosome that's kind of falling apart. It doesn't have much information on it. So that leads to something that we're going to talk about called sex-linked traits. So when we say a trait's sex-linked, we don't mean that it's related to sex in any meaningful way. In fact, the first example we're going to use red-green color blindness. Does anyone know what that is? Sorry? Oh, I love it. So tell me about it.
It requires, from what I've looked at, it requires all of your X chromosomes to have a certain...
Oh, definitely, and we'll get there in a minute. But just symptomatically, what are the symptoms? If I'm red-green colorblind, what's that mean for me?
You can't see red or green.
Yeah, red-green colorblindness is caused by a mutant allele which inhibits proper color vision. It does so by damaging one of your color sensors, but we're not going to get into that. In grade 10, I hope you talked about how your eyes work, how you have rod and cone cells. And how many color sensors do we have? 3. Yeah, so even though there's a literal infinite rainbow of possible colors, we can only see 3 different spectra, and it is the combination of these things that give us our kind of perceived color vision. This is why you can be tricked right? If you look at that screen right now, if I put this yellow here, that projector cannot produce the color yellow. It can only produce the color red, the color green, the color blue. So there isn't actually any yellow light coming off that screen. And an animal or a machine that could see true color vision, could actually see the whole rainbow, would know that that's not yellow. It would know that it's actually the red light and the green light shining at the same time. But your eye can't tell the difference because you only have 3 color sensors. And some people don't have 3 working color sensors. They only have 2. And so they can't tell even other combinations. You can trick their eyes more easily because they don't have the same level of color definition that you do. So now the good news is it's a recessive trait. It's a recessive trait because as long as you have one good copy of the gene to make color vision, then you're good. But it is also, the gene is found on the X chromosome. And that's what makes it sex-linked. All right? This is why we refer to it as sex-linked. Not because it has anything to do with sex, not because it has anything to do with biological sex, but because it's found on the X chromosome, which means that females have 2 copies, but males have only 1. This means when we go to think about this trait, we actually have to think of it as if it had 3 alleles. So it actually only has 2 alleles. So we'll talk about the alleles. And the alleles are X big C, which is normal color vision. And this is terrible, but this is indeed what they use. X little c, which is color blindness. But let's actually just go with N, even though it's not actually what they use, because I think the C thing is destined to be miserable. Can we all agree on that? And also, we normally use the N anyway, right? So let's just go like that. But, of course, there is a third allele, which I'm not even going to bother putting in quotation marks, which is if you have the Y chromosome, you have no copy of this gene at all. In other words, it does nothing. Does that make sense?
So if you're a guy.
So if you had 2 copies of the Y chromosome, well, you wouldn't be alive because it doesn't work that way. But the Y chromosome has no bearing on this. It just has nothing to do with it. There's no copy of that gene at all. It doesn't do anything. Does that make sense? So now, what are the possible genotypes? Well, you could be X normal, X normal. What's the phenotype there? Well, there's really 2 things to consider. First of all, if you have 2 X's, what are you? Female. And then what's the color vision like? Yeah, normal color vision. Okay. What if you have X big N, X little n? Then what are you? Female, and you're still normal color vision. That's right. And how do you know that? Why would that person also be normal? Don't they have both genes?
Because
That's right. Color blindness is recessive, so the normal is dominant. So you have to have, what would somebody have to, the genotype have to look like to be female and be colorblind? Yeah, X small n would be female and colorblind. What are the other 2 genotypes? There's 2 more. X big N and Y. What's this?
male.
Male and
Normal.
normal. And finally, X little n and Y. And that is male, but this male is colorblind. All right, what do you notice? Yeah. We're going to ask a couple of questions, but I kind of like this responsibility approach. If I'm a colorblind male, which parent should I resent? People are really quick to be like, resent your dad. Like, Greg, get out of here. If I'm a colorblind male, which parent should I blame?
Your dad, because if your dad gave the right chromosome, he could have stopped it. Just saying. He could have.
Well, let's ask. Let's say, listen. Okay. Let's look at a couple examples. I don't even care. Give me a. We want mom and dad to both possibly be the person at fault, right? Just at the outset. So, mom, do we want her to be colorblind or do we want her to be what we call a carrier? And by the way, this person here we refer to as being a carrier, which is to say they carry a copy of the disease gene, but they themselves are not. So, do you want homozygous recessive for mom or heterozygous for mom? What do you want? Homozygous recessive? Okay. So let's do a mother who is colorblind. All right? And let's do a father who is also colorblind. Maybe they went to maybe there's like a monthly dinner for people who are colorblind. And they all wear horribly mismatched fashions, and nobody notices.
What if they have different color blindness?
What are the possible gametes for mom?
XN and XN?
Okay, so she's either passing on her colorblind gene, or she's passing on a colorblind gene. She's got two copies. What about dad?
X little n and y.
Yeah, so what are his two possibilities then? He either gives that, or he gives that. Okay, so first of all, how many of the kids are going to be colorblind?
All of them.
Yeah, is that right? Are they all going to be colorblind?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no normal color vision gene to be had here, right? So this person here, what are they?
X little
XN. So talk to me. They're female and colorblind. Okay. What about here? Same thing. Okay.
That sucks. Just better, I guess.
Okay. What about here?
X little n and a y.
X little n and a y. And this person is male and colorblind. And here? Same thing. Okay. So everyone involved is colorblind. Now, obviously, the daughters, they can resent which of their parents? Both their parents. What about sons?
Just their mom.
Just mom. Does that make sense? So the colorblind gene
My favorite color so many times.
was passed to the sons. I'm going to say the male offsprings. Via the mother. Right? If we did a different circumstance where, what if a colorblind mom and a normal vision father?
It would still.
What are the frequencies of the F1? I'm just going to say frequencies. You guys can know, I mean, phenotypic and genotypic. So take a minute.
Is it?
What did I say? NG1. What am I talking about? That's an entirely different thing. Okay, so I want you to do the same thing. You have a colorblind mom and you have a normal vision father. What are their kids going to be like?
What is the sentence you just said? If you have something.
If you have a colorblind mom and a normal vision father, what are the genotypic and the phenotypic frequencies of their offspring? Or their offspring going to be like? Obviously, I don't mean like they're gonna be nice. They're gonna like jazz. I don't know. That's not helpful. They're gonna collect vintage bottle caps.
I love bottle caps.
Sure. Mhm. Ah, good question. Because where did this gene come? This chromosome come from? Dad. Is that making this male colorblind?
No.
It's got nothing to do with color vision. Where did the disease gene come from? Mom. What about here? Where did the disease gene come from? Mom. And why? Has nothing to do with color vision. So only mom can pass that on to sons because only mom is giving that chromosome to sons. Dad is giving the Y chromosome, which doesn't have any of that information. Does that make sense? Cool. See if that helps you understand when you do this one.
I got it.
Good for you.
In my head.
I don't want you to do it in your head. I want you to do it on paper. Go on. I'll write you a song. Big N is dominant, little n is recessive. That's right.
What were you gonna say?
I was going to say, shh, stop having fun, start doing biology. Mutually exclusive, don't you know? No fun in science class. You think this is? English class? I was just baiting somebody to say that. Thank you. I'll note that 26 other people remain silent, but that's okay. We'll move on. Can I say I loved English class? I was never very good at it. I didn't get my best marks in English, but I always really, really, really enjoyed English class. I enjoyed science class too.
We spent first period hearing about Greg's grandfather killing dogs.
Yeah.
We spent like half the period talking about stuff.
I mean, devoid of context, that sounds really cruel, but I happen to have been present for a few of these, and I would say it's a kindness. Very sad, but, you know.
The way that you described it did not sound very...
Well, okay, so listen, I love dogs. I'm a dog guy. And have you ever had to, like, I don't even like talking about this, but that awful thing where you, like, load your car up for the trip to the vet, where they, like, and then you go and, like, hold them down on a table while they get a needle? That's pretty traumatic and pretty horrifying. Versus they go to bed, have a nice meal, and then they don't wake up. I don't love it, but... They don't get shoved in front of anything. You run a hose to the crate, and they go to bed in the crate just like they do every day. You give them a nice meal, and then they don't wake up. And again, not happy, very sad, but I think a kindness. Yeah, well, that's the typical farm thing is just you shoot the dog, right? A, I couldn't do that, and B, we don't have a gun. But
I went to go live on a farm.
yeah. All right, what's this look like?
Well, let's create. Are we doing this step by step?
No, I won't be difficult because we're running out of time. So we're going to make a grid. What's the mom in this case? If she's colorblind, what do her... She's got to be homozygous recessive, right? Which means that no matter what is she passing on? That diseased, that colorblind allele, right? What about dad? If he's regular color vision, what goes here? Which means no matter what isn't he passing on? Yeah, it doesn't have it, right? A mom can have the gene and not have the disease, but a dad can't, right? What will this person be? Yeah. Here? And here? Yeah, and here? Okay, so a colorblind mother and a non-colorblind father have kids. What do the kids look like? Okay, 50% female. True. What else? Yeah, so normal color vision, right? Versus the males are both what? Colorblind. So listen, in a world that so often, is well suited to, to men getting, the better deal, here is a rare case where, man, the male offspring really get shafted here, eh? Right? 100% colorblind. Female offspring, 100% not colorblind.
That's what you get.
That's what I get. I'm not colorblind. You wouldn't know it by how I dress, but I actually have perfectly functioning color vision. These are choices, people. Anyway, we discovered in biology class that my friend Brandon Wickens was colorblind. tomorrow, if I get a chance, we'll look at a few of the things that you look at to test for color blindness. There are these color splotches you look at, and we did this because this is now you can just Google that, right? But again, like that didn't exist when I was your age. And so we were in biology class, and our teacher had these cards you look at and look around, and my friend Brandon, I could see him going like. I said, "What?" He said, "I'm seeing the colorblind one." I said, "Really?" And then I looked at what he was wearing, and I thought, Brandon, the orange, brown, and blue that you were wearing at the same time right now is really coming into focus. And he was like, "I had no idea." It's like, this is why I always did so bad in art class. Anyway, yeah. Anyway, he's a surgeon now. He did all right for himself.
Can you not be a police officer if you have the other type of color blindness?
I don't know.
Like the red, blue?
Couldn't tell you.
Yellow, red.
Couldn't tell you. Anyway, so in this case, 100% of the female offsprings are... Whoa, what's going on with my pen? Hate when that happens.
Oh, it's getting all jumbled.
Yeah, that happens every once in a while and just takes a minute to settle down. So 100% of the female offspring are normal. And what about the male offspring?
Not normal.
Yeah, 100% colorblind. Has anyone else in their research come across another sex-linked trait? Another very famous one that famously affected the royal families of Europe. Anyone know it? Has anyone heard of hemophilia? It's such a profoundly unkind name for this. Heme as a prefix, what's it mean? Blood, yeah. Philia means love of. So somebody who is blood loving. Does this mean the vampires or something? No. It means that the blood lacks a clotting agent. So when they get a cut, they will just keep bleeding. Can you imagine having a disease where a minor cut could be fatal because your blood just doesn't clot? And they say, "What's the name of your disease?" "Ah, you really love blood, eh?" See how that's kind of an unkind name? Anyway, hemophilia is another sex-linked trait. So in the royal family, many of the males in the European royal families, which were all intermarried, suffered from hemophilia. And of course, very few of the females, because again, you have to have 2 copies of that recessive allele to be a hemophiliac female, and only 1 copy to be a hemophiliac male. And so profoundly more common. Any questions about that? All right, what's due tomorrow?
The project.
Yeah, your projects. I'm done. All right, listen. Whatever it looks like tomorrow, I'm taking it. All right, and after that's 5% a day. If you don't, give it to me, but just give it to me because I'm going to try to get those back the next day or maybe 2 days later, and I'm not taking them after I give them back. Does that make sense? Get on it. You'd rather hand in what you've got than get 0, I promise. Even if what you've got is complete and utter trash, beat 0. Don't be... Oh, stay a while, will you? I haven't heard a bell. Yeah, don't.
Oh, sorry.
I don't do this thing.
Not bad.
What am I, in English class right now?
No, we do our plays in English class.
Your plays? What's your play?